This program is made possible in part by grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Safeco Insurance Companies, and Mrs. Damaris D.W. Etheridge.
They gave up some 2 billion acres of land. They learned to speak and conduct their business in a foreign tongue. Their national boundaries were defined and redefined by a nation of immigrants. The American Indians have survived almost 5 centuries of change imposed by non-Indians. Through it all, they have struggled to maintain their lands, their cultures, their identity as separate political entities, sovereign nations. They have lost most of their original land base. Their cultures have been undermined by centuries of American policy. Their political sovereignty has been threatened throughout American history, but it has never been lost or taken away. Their history has been shaped as much by the laws of the government that grew up around them as it was by their own laws. The North American continent is a vast land of grand spaces and varied climates. Rich and fertile, it has been home to many people and many nations. Americans learn as school children that Columbus sailed across the ocean to discover this land and claim it for the Spanish crown. His discovery opened a new world to generations of Europeans who found on this continent immense and inviting opportunity. They also found people living in every corner of the continent. There were fishing societies in the Pacific Northwest, hunters and gatherers on the Great Plains, urban villagers in the Southwest. Europeans called these people Indians. The people had other names for themselves in their native tongues, and these names generally translated to mean the first people, the original people, or simply the people. When Columbus discovered their homeland, they were living in orderly and productive communities across the continent, with religions, cultures, and governments of their own. Today, after centuries of contact with non-Indians, American Indians still maintain strong cultures and governments. After centuries of struggle, America's Indian nations own less than 2% of the continent, which was first settled by their ancestors.
So are we traditionalists then? Are we assimilated? What are we? We're a continuing society is what we are. And if you can get away from your categories and definitions, then you may perceive us as what we are, a living, continuing entity. And that our culture, what we believe, the wampum should be home, the mask should be home, we'll continue our ceremonies, you continue your ceremonies, we'll respect one another, just as the Turo wampum said so long ago. But we have the right to exist, and that right doesn't come from you or your government.
From the beginning, the Europeans who came to America acknowledged the legal and political rights of Indians and their claims to this land. The Spaniards who settled here recognized the political existence of Indian tribes as early as the 16th century. So did the English who came later. And finally, the Constitution of the United States reaffirmed their rights as sovereign nations. Throughout the 19th century, treaties between the United States and the tribes continued to acknowledge the tribes' inherent right to self-government and defined a special relationship between the United States and Indian nations. This came to be called the trust relationship. Most treaties involved the exchange of lands. Tribes were moved off their ancestral lands to lands reserved for them. In return, the United States promised to protect the safety and well-being of tribes and their lands forever. That promise, made in treaties, became the basis of the trust relationship. Sam DeLauria, director of the American Indian Law Center.
It's a public trust that has developed over the years in response to a whole complex of congressional and social motivations and fears about Indians and prejudices and projections of of notions of civilization versus savagism and a whole complex of concerns, including, on the one hand, the recognition of tribal political independence and social independence, and at the same time, an incredible paternalism and notion that Indians have to be protected.
As Mr. Delory observes, the United States developed an ambivalent policy towards its native populations early in its history. While it recognized the political sovereignty of tribes and treated them as nations, the U.S. also laid claim to tribal lands, responding to the non-Indian pressure for those lands. Even today, many non-Indians continue to approach Indian populations with ambivalence. They buy souvenirs from what they believe is a vanishing culture, and they don't understand why contemporary Indians no longer resemble their 18th century ancestors. According to this view, the Indian culture of the 18th century is the only true native culture, and the modern-day Indians should honor the past in special ceremonies or festivals. But they should also abandon it and assimilate themselves into the 20th century. Today's ambivalence toward Indians seems to say that the cultural and political claims of Indian America are quaint and colorful. They add a unique chapter to our country's history, but they are old-fashioned and out of place in the modern world. Indian America would disagree with that view. Historian Roger Buffalo Head.
When the 20th century began, most Americans who thought about Indians at all did so in the past tense. Like a photograph, the image and culture of Indian people were frozen in time. Yet for Indians, the 20th century was to become a time of recovery. Instead of a photograph, Indian life and culture was more like a motion picture, and the storyline or plot moved on, transcending the ending which American history seemed to have confirmed for Native Americans.
Because I'm not afraid to speak up about this, because it is important to the continuation of our culture that we have at least the respect of the people who now occupy our lands, of our culture. We will determine, what our culture is. And it was pointed out, I thought, rather explicitly this morning, that culture is a continuum. It changes. It's not the same today as it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago. We are a vital, active society that continues. And as such, we're not going to coincide with interpretations. We're not going to sit still to be put in a museum. We're not going to accept your interpretation of our culture. And so I hope that what I say is taken with the respect that it's presented.
Taos, Pueblo, home of the Taos Tiwa people, is one of the oldest communities in the United States. For as long as man has counted time in this part of the world, long before Columbus arrived, the people of Taos were living here. Their first contact with non-Indians was in 1540, when a regiment of Spanish conquistadors encountered the Pueblo. Searching for the legendary cities of gold, they found instead an established community with a distinctive adobe architecture and a rich, expressive culture. The Pueblos respect an ancient way of life, and their respect for tradition often confuses visitors who see in these old buildings a nostalgic reminder of simpler days gone by. Taos, only 70 miles north of Santa Fe, is one of 19 pueblos in New Mexico, and all of these communities have maintained visible ties to the ancient way of life. Like Taos, the other